I need to get this out because I've been sitting on it for weeks, and if I don't write it down, I'm going to lose it. Me, 32M, and Annie, 30F, were together 9 years, married 6. We have a son who just turned 7. We lived in a house I bought before we got engaged. My name on the deed, my down payment, my credit. Annie moved in after the wedding, but never touched the mortgage because her income went to our future, which meant her car payments and whatever her sister Deborah needed that month. Deborah, 34F, moved back from out of state 4 years ago after her second divorce. Annie let her crash at our place for what was supposed to be 2 weeks. That became 5 months. She ate our food, ran up the electric bill, parked her Nissan Rogue in my spot, so I had to street park every night, and spent every waking moment telling Annie I wasn't ambitious enough, wasn't exciting enough, wasn't the kind of man their father Jonathan was. Jonathan walked out on their mother when Deborah was 12, came back 6 years later, acting like nothing happened, and somehow became the gold standard for manhood in that family. Annie wasn't always like this. The first few years were good, but once Deborah moved in, Annie started comparing everything. Why didn't we take trips? Why didn't I buy her things? Why was I always tired? I was tired because I was working 60-hour weeks while her sister lived rent-free in our guest room, calling me a loser. I confronted Annie about it multiple times, and every time she told me I was dramatic, that Deborah was family, that I needed compassion. Deborah eventually left, but the damage was permanent. Annie talked to her on the phone for hours daily, and the entire tone of our house changed. Annie started sleeping in the guest room, stopped coming to our son's soccer games, rolled her eyes whenever I talked about work. Now the part that broke everything. Our dog Ross, a 12-year-old lab mix I'd had since before Annie and I even dated, got diagnosed with liver failure last October. That last Thursday night, he couldn't get comfortable, kept pacing and whimpering. So I laid on the living room floor next to him with a blanket and stayed there all night. Around 8 a.m., I got up, because Ross had finally settled, and I figured I'd grab an hour of sleep before school drop-off. I walked down the hallway and heard Annie in the kitchen on speakerphone with Deborah. She didn't know I was right there behind the wall. Annie said I'd spent the whole night on the floor with the dog and called me pathetic, said I was like a mutt myself, that I'd grovel for scraps if someone just raised their voice, that she wished I'd just vanish. Deborah laughed and asked why Annie didn't just throw me out, said I wasn't even a man. I stood there maybe 10 seconds, walked into the kitchen, grabbed my keys and my son's backpack, got him dressed, put him in the truck, drove him to school. Didn't say one word to Annie. She saw me walk through and she knew I'd heard because her face went white, but she didn't say anything either. After drop-off, I drove to my friend Tabitha's place. She's known me since high school. I sat in her driveway 20 minutes before going inside and told her everything. Every year of Deborah's influence. Every time Annie chose her sister over our marriage. That morning's phone call. Tabitha said what I already knew but needed to hear. That this wasn't new. That the call was just the first time I caught it unfiltered. She called 11 times that night. I picked up on the 12th, and she immediately started saying I was overreacting, that I took things out of context, that she and Deborah were just venting the way sisters do. I told her I heard exactly what she said, and no context makes it okay to call your husband pathetic while he's up all night with a dying dog. She switched to saying I was selfish for taking our son without asking, and I told her he was with his father in a safe apartment and she could see him Saturday. She started yelling that I couldn't just decide that. I told her I already did, and hung up. Ross died 2 days later. I was alone with him at the vet. Annie didn't ask about him once. That was 3 weeks ago. And here's where it gets complicated because this isn't just about what Annie said on the phone. That was the match, but the fire had been building for years. Jonathan called me last week playing peacemaker, and I told him something that made him go completely silent. I'm not ready to share that part yet because things are still in motion. But the people who spent years treating me like furniture are about to find out how much weight that furniture was holding up. More soon. Bro was on the floor, sleeping on cold hardwood next to a dog he's had for 12 years. A dog that was there before Annie, before the marriage, before everything, and this man's wife. The person who stood at an altar and said, in sickness and in health, is in the next room turning it into comedy material for her twice-divorced sister. Like I genuinely need everyone to sit with that image for a second. A man's best friend is dying. He's on the floor holding him, and his wife is doing a set about it, on speakerphone, at 8 in the morning, like it's a morning show segment. And Deborah, a woman who has been divorced twice, who couldn't keep her own life together long enough to pay rent, who was eating this man's groceries and running up his electric bill and parking in his spot. This woman is laughing and questioning his manhood. Ma'am, your track record with men is 0 for 2. You're batting absolutely nothing. You are the last person on earth who should be evaluating what a man is. But honestly, what really gets me is the silence after. He walked through that kitchen. She saw him. Her face went white, and neither of them said a single word. That silence is the loudest moment in this whole story because in that moment, Annie knew. She knew she'd been caught being exactly who she'd been pretending she wasn't, and she didn't apologize. She didn't chase him. She didn't even try. She just let him walk out. Because somewhere inside her, she knew there was no explaining that away. And then Ross dies 2 days later, and she doesn't ask about him once. Not once. A 12-year-old dog that lived in her home, that her son probably loved. And she can't even send a text. That tells you everything you need to know about who Annie became. That's not a rough patch. That's not sisters venting. That's someone who checked out of their own humanity. Update 1. Alright, so a lot of you wanted to know what I said to Jonathan and what's been happening since. I need to lay this out in order because stuff escalated fast and in directions I didn't expect. After I moved into the sublet with my son, Annie spent the first week framing the whole thing as me having a breakdown over the dog. She told Jonathan and Deborah I'd snapped and wasn't thinking clearly. Jonathan drove 40 minutes to my apartment that Sunday, showed up unannounced, sat at my kitchen table trying to talk sense into me. He kept saying marriages go through rough patches, that Annie was sorry even if she hadn't said it right, that I needed to think about my son. This is where I used something I'd been saving. About 2 years ago, Annie let something slip during a fight. She was yelling about how I never made her feel valued and said Deborah had been telling her she could do better since before we even got married, and that Jonathan agreed. I filed that away. Then about a year ago, I was at Jonathan's helping him move furniture, and his wife, Annie's stepmother, mentioned casually that Jonathan had pushed Annie toward marrying me specifically because I owned the house and had stable income. She said it like everyone already knew. So when Jonathan sat at my table playing peacemaker, I told him I knew everything. I knew he pushed Annie to marry me for the house and stability, that Deborah had been undermining me since before the wedding, that the two of them treated my marriage like a parking spot until something better came along. He went quiet, then tried to deny it, said his wife exaggerated. I told him it didn't matter because I'd already started the separation process and would be filing for full custody based on Annie voluntarily disengaging from parenting for over a year. No soccer games, no school pickups, no conferences. I had every unanswered school email, every sign-up sheet with only my name on it. Jonathan left and went straight to Annie's. They had a massive fight, not about what he did, but about the fact that I knew. Annie was furious, her stepmother told me. That changed the whole dynamic because now Annie and Jonathan were at each other's throats instead of focused on me. Deborah got pulled in because Annie called her ranting and Deborah took Jonathan's side, said Annie was being ungrateful. So now Annie was fighting with both of them. For everyone asking about the house, she has no claim. I bought it before the marriage, kept it solely in my name, and she never contributed to the mortgage or taxes. My attorney confirmed it's not marital property in our state. But here's the new problem. Annie realized that if I kept the house and got primary custody, she'd have nothing. No home, limited time with our son, and she'd have to move in with either Deborah or Jonathan, both of whom she was now fighting with. So she went to the school on Wednesday and tried to change the emergency contacts and pickup authorization to remove me and add Deborah instead. The school called me because I'm listed as primary custodial contact and they needed my approval. I drove over during lunch and shut it down. I also told the principal that nobody except me was authorized for pickup until further notice. When I confronted Annie about it by phone that evening, she didn't try to hide it. She said she was protecting her son, and I was being vindictive, and she had every right to make decisions about his schooling. I told her she hadn't made a single decision about his schooling in over a year, and she didn't get to start now because it was strategically convenient. She hung up. That Friday, Deborah showed up at my apartment. She got the address from Jonathan, who'd been there the previous Sunday. She stood in the hallway telling me I was destroying the family, that Annie made one mistake and I was blowing up everyone's lives. I told her the phone call wasn't one mistake. It was 4 years of her poisoning my marriage because she was miserable after 2 divorces and couldn't stand watching her sister have something stable. She told me Annie had always complained about me even before Deborah moved in. I told her that was fine. Annie could complain from whatever apartment she found next because she wasn't getting back into my house. So that's where things stand. Annie is fighting with Jonathan and Deborah. She tried to move at the school and got caught. I've got the house, my son, and an attorney. But something happened this week with Jonathan that changed everything about how I'm handling this, and I need another day to figure out how much to share. To the guy who told me to forgive because marriage is sacred, respectfully, no. This man was a project, not a husband. A project. Jonathan literally scouted him like a fantasy draft pick. Oh, he's got a house. Stable income. Good credit? Yeah, marry that one. Lock it down. Like he was picking a financial vehicle for his daughter to ride until the wheels fell off. This man got selected like a host organism. And the sickest part is that Jonathan came to his table, in his apartment, eating presumably his food, trying to talk him into going back to the arrangement that Jonathan designed to exploit him. The audacity of sitting across from someone you engineered into a trap and telling them they should crawl back into it for the family. And then the school move. I need everyone to understand how wild that is. Annie hasn't shown up to a single school event in over a year, hasn't picked this kid up, hasn't responded to emails. But the second custody is on the line. Suddenly she's at the front office trying to remove the father and add Deborah, a woman who is not this child's parent, not his guardian, not his anything, as the pickup contact. She didn't try to add herself. She tried to add her sister. Because this was never about the kid. This was about control. This was about making a chess move, and she used her own son as the piece. And Deborah showing up at his apartment talking about, "You're destroying the family." Ma'am, what family? The family where you moved in for 5 months, ate their food, stole his parking spot, and spent every day telling his wife he was garbage? The family where you called him not even a man while laughing about him comforting his dying dog? That family. Because from where I'm standing, this man was never part of your family. He was the wallet your family passed around. The fact that all three of them are fighting each other now is chef's kiss. Because this is what happens when the person holding everything together stops holding. The whole structure collapses and everybody inside starts blaming each other for the wreckage. They spent years unified by one common purpose, using this man. And the moment he removed himself, they had nothing left to agree on. Update 2. I said something happened with Jonathan that changed everything. Here it is. After Jonathan and Annie had their blow-up about me knowing the truth, Jonathan panicked. He came back to my apartment the following Wednesday, uninvited again, but this time he wasn't playing peacemaker. He was trying to cut a deal. He sat down and told me that if I dropped the custody filing and let Annie back into the house, he would personally make sure Deborah stayed out of our lives permanently. He said he'd cut Deborah off, stop taking her calls, pressure Annie to do the same. He was offering me Deborah's head on a plate to save his own reputation because what terrified Jonathan wasn't losing Annie. It was his wife finding out the full scope of what he'd done. See, Jonathan's wife didn't just casually mention one thing to me that day. Over that year, I'd been at their house multiple times helping with projects, and she'd said more than she realized piece by piece. Jonathan had actively coached Annie on how to manage me. He told her to let me handle all the bills so she could keep her income flexible. He told her not to put her name on the house because then she wouldn't be liable if anything went wrong. He basically designed a setup where Annie got all the benefits of the marriage with none of the financial responsibility. And I carried everything. I looked at Jonathan and told him no deal. I told him I wasn't interested in trading one manipulator for another and that Deborah wasn't even the real problem, he was. He'd spent years teaching his daughter that I was a resource to be managed, not a partner. Deborah just said out loud what Jonathan had been engineering quietly. He started arguing that he was trying to protect Annie, that any father would do the same, that I was twisting his intentions. I told him his intentions didn't matter because the result was the same. I spent 6 years being used and mocked by people who lived off my work. Then I told Jonathan the part that really got him. I told him I'd already spoken to his wife directly. I'd called her the day after his first visit and thanked her for being honest with me years ago, and told her exactly what Jonathan had been doing behind the scenes with Annie and Deborah. She didn't know the full picture. She knew he'd encouraged the marriage, but she didn't know he'd been coaching Annie on finances or that he'd been enabling Deborah's interference. Jonathan's face changed completely because he realized this wasn't just about me and Annie anymore. His own marriage was now on the table. Jonathan left, and within 2 days, Annie was at my door. Not Deborah this time, Annie herself. She was parked outside my apartment complex sobbing, slamming her fists on the door. She wasn't apologizing, though. She was furious. She said I'd gone too far by involving Jonathan's wife, that I was ripping her entire family apart, that her father was now sleeping on his own couch because of me. I stood in the doorway and told her that her father put himself on that couch by spending years manipulating both of us and that if she wanted someone to blame, she should start with the man who treated her marriage like a business arrangement he could control from the outside. Annie switched tactics. She started saying none of this would have happened if I'd just talked to her instead of leaving, that I never gave her a chance to explain, that couples are supposed to work through things. I told her I tried to work through Deborah for 4 years, and she dismissed me every single time. And the morning I overheard her calling me pathetic while I was grieving my dog was the last time I was ever going to ask her to choose me over her family, because she'd made that choice 1,000 times already. She asked if I was really going through with the custody filing. I told her yes. She asked about the house. I told her I'd already changed the locks the previous weekend and her remaining belongings were boxed in the garage and she could arrange a time with Tabitha to pick them up because I wasn't going to be there for it. She started crying and said I was punishing her for one conversation. I told her it wasn't one conversation, it was years. And that conversation was just the first time she was stupid enough to let me hear it. She left. But here's what I didn't expect. Deborah called me 2 hours later. First time she'd ever called me directly. She wasn't yelling. She was calculated. She told me that if I pushed this custody case, she would testify that I was emotionally unstable, that I'd been controlling during the marriage, that I'd isolated Annie from her family. She said she had text messages from Annie over the years describing fights we'd had, and she'd use every one of them. I told Deborah she could bring whatever she wanted to court because I had 6 years of school records, medical appointments, and financial documents showing exactly which parent was present and which one wasn't, and that a judge wouldn't care about secondhand text messages from a bitter sister-in-law when the actual evidence told a completely different story. Deborah hung up. That was 4 days ago. I've got my attorney preparing the formal filing. Jonathan's marriage is falling apart. Annie has nowhere to go. And I'm not done yet. Final update coming soon. Jonathan tried to trade Deborah like a Pokemon card. I'll sacrifice my other daughter's access to the family if you just put everything back the way it was. Like he's at a negotiating table moving pieces around. And that tells you everything about how this man sees people. Deborah isn't his daughter to him, she's a bargaining chip. Annie isn't his daughter, she's an investment. And OP was never his son-in-law, he was the infrastructure. Jonathan doesn't have a family, he has a portfolio. And now his assets are crashing. And I genuinely love, that OP had already called Jonathan's wife. Like Jonathan walked in thinking he was playing 4D chess, and this man had already flipped the board 2 days ago. Jonathan sat down with his little deal, thinking he had leverage, and OP was sitting there, knowing that the grenade was already thrown, the pin was already pulled, and Jonathan just hadn't heard the explosion yet. That is cinema. That is poetry. But the thing that kills me is Annie at the door saying, "You never gave me a chance to explain." Ma'am, 4 years. He gave her 4 years of chances. He brought up Deborah multiple times. She called him dramatic. She told him to have compassion. She rolled her eyes at him. She moved into the guest room. She stopped going to her own kids' soccer games. He didn't leave after one bad day. He left after 1,461 bad days, and she's acting like he owed her one more conversation. That's not someone who wants to fix things. That's someone who wants more time. More time to keep the arrangement going. More time to figure out a counter strategy. More time in the house she never paid for. And now all three of them, Annie, Deborah, and Jonathan, are crammed into a 2-bedroom furious at each other. They spent years as a team. Team use this man and laugh about it. And now the team is stuck in a 2-bedroom with no funding because the guy they were laughing at took his ball and went home. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Final update. Last one. Strap in. After Deborah threatened to testify against me, I expected Annie to escalate. Instead, she went quiet for 5 days. No calls, no texts, no showing up. That silence was worse than the screaming because I knew she was planning something. Tabitha told me Annie had reached out to her on Instagram trying to get information, asking how my son was adjusting, whether I was seeing anyone, what my schedule looked like. Tabitha didn't respond and sent me screenshots of everything. What Annie was actually doing during those 5 days was trying to get Deborah to move into the house with her. My house. Deborah had been staying in a month-to-month rental since she left our place, and Annie figured if she had Deborah physically living there, it would be harder for me to reclaim it. My attorney shut that down fast. He sent Annie a formal letter stating that as the sole owner of the property, I was exercising my right to terminate her occupancy, and she had 30 days to vacate. Annie had no lease, no ownership stake, nothing. She'd been living there as a spouse, and now that the marriage was ending, she had no legal basis to stay. Annie tried to fight it. She called me the night she got the letter, and for the first time she actually tried to have a real conversation. She said she knew she'd been wrong, that the phone call with Deborah was disgusting and she didn't mean it, that she'd been unhappy for a long time and let Deborah's bitterness become her own voice instead of dealing with her problems like an adult. She asked if there was any path back. I told her no. She asked why I wouldn't even consider it, and I told her because I'd spent 4 years considering it, 4 years trying to talk to her, 4 years being shut down and belittled. And the morning she called me a pathetic mutt while I held our dying dog was the morning I stopped considering anything, except how to get out and make sure she felt exactly what I'd been feeling. She asked me what that meant, and I told her. I told her the house would be emptied and sold. I told her I'd take the proceeds and use them to set up a proper home for me and our son. I told her the custody filing was already submitted, and my attorney was confident based on the documentation that I'd get primary. I told her Jonathan's wife had already confirmed she'd provide a statement about Jonathan's financial coaching if it came to that. Every single person Annie had relied on to prop up her comfortable life was either gone or actively working against her now, and she'd done it to herself. Then came the part I'd been waiting for. Annie put Deborah on the line. Deborah started in immediately, calling me selfish, saying I was weaponizing a family disagreement, that Annie said things out of frustration and I was using it to steal a child from his mother. I let her go for about 2 minutes. Then I told Deborah that her threat to testify had been forwarded to my attorney, that making false statements in a custody proceeding carries legal consequences, and that my attorney had already pulled Annie's phone records, showing that Deborah was the primary contact during every single period where Annie disengaged from parenting. Every time Annie skipped a school event, every time she slept in the guest room, every time she checked out, there was a 4-hour phone call with Deborah right before it. The pattern was documented, and it showed exactly who was influencing Annie's behavior and when. Deborah didn't have a response for that. She told me I was going to regret this and hung up. 2 weeks later, Annie moved out of the house. She went to Jonathan's, which is ironic because Jonathan and his wife were barely speaking at that point. Deborah's rental lease was up and she couldn't afford to renew on her own, so she moved in with Jonathan too. 3 adults crammed into a 2-bedroom house, all of them furious at each other. All of them there because of choices they made over years of treating me like I didn't matter. The custody hearing was scheduled. My attorney presented the school records, the medical records, the pattern of Annie's disengagement, the phone records showing Deborah's influence. Annie's attorney argued for joint custody but couldn't produce evidence of Annie's active involvement in our son's daily life for the past 18 months. I was awarded primary custody. Annie got weekends. I listed the house last week. My son and I moved into a 2-bedroom closer to his school. It's smaller, but it's ours, and nobody in it thinks I'm pathetic. I keep my son's drawing of Ross on the fridge. Every morning I see it, and I remember that night on the floor, my hand on his fur, listening to him breathe. I remember walking down that hallway at 8 a.m. and hearing exactly who my wife really was. And I remember deciding right then that nobody would ever talk about me like that again while living under a roof I paid for. They treated me like a mutt. Turns out this mutt bites. That last line is going to live in my head for a long time, because this whole story is really about one thing. What happens when someone who's been quiet finally decides to be loud? And not loud the way Deborah is loud, not screaming in the hallway loud, not sobbing at the door loud. Loud in the way that actually matters. Paperwork loud. Attorney loud. Documentation loud. School records and phone records and custody filings loud. This man didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. He just organized his entire exit with the precision of someone who'd been mentally rehearsing it for years and only needed one final reason to press go. And the phone records connecting Deborah's calls to Annie's parenting drop-offs? That's not just evidence. That's a masterpiece of pattern recognition. Every time Annie disappeared as a mother, there's a 4-hour call with Deborah right before it. He didn't just feel the influence, he mapped it. He built a timeline of his own marriage falling apart and showed exactly which outside force was pulling the strings at every turn. Deborah walked into that potential courtroom thinking she had ammunition, and this man had a geological survey of every crack she'd ever caused. But I want to be real for a second. The part that actually matters most in this entire story isn't the legal wins, or Jonathan's couch, or Deborah's empty threats. It's that drawing on the fridge. It's a 7-year-old kid's crayon drawing of a dog named Ross, and it's hanging in a kitchen where his dad is making him breakfast and taking him to school and showing up to his soccer games. That kid is going to grow up knowing what it looks like when someone refuses to be disrespected. Not through anger, not through revenge, through action. Through choosing yourself and your kid over people who made you feel small. Annie said he was like a mutt. Nah, a mutt is loyal, resilient, survives things purebreds can't, and loves harder than anything on 4 legs. If being a mutt means sleeping on the floor with your dying best friend while the people who are supposed to love you laugh about it in the next room, and then getting up the next morning and building a whole new life from scratch, then yeah, he's a mutt, and mutts don't forget who kicked them.